Hey students, I hope you're doing well. We're going to go over assignment number 4, and that was where we were trying to use shutter speed settings in a way where we can do one of two basic techniques for motion, the blur and the freeze. So I asked you to shoot 6 photos, and they were essentially, I thought, would be where you use the same general subject or environment and just use your settings on the shutter varying from slow shutter like 1/8 to medium shutter like 1/100th of a second to fast shutter anything over 1/500th of a second. When you use the faster one, you freeze the subject. Then I asked you to use the panning technique, and I suspect that I didn't really get this across to you as well as I would have liked. But basically with the panning technique, you're following your subject in motion from left to right or right to left with your camera. And then I just asked for 4 other photographs where you could demonstrate the use of shutter speed settings. So that was 11 photos, and we have to get used to doing this as best we can, and that is to include information for each photograph. And you have to tell me whether it's shutter 1 or panning 1 or 2. Always tell me what camera you use, and for this particular exercise I wanted to see what shutter speed you had for each photo. Now I know that's something for those that use the cell phone cameras, it's a little more tricky to use. So let's get into this. All right, so this motion capture, the camera is out here and a setting of 1/1250th of a second, which in this one, the truck here is basically frozen. In this one, the van, and this is 1/30th of a second. And you can see the whole background here isn't in motion. And this is actually a good shot because of this. But the van that's moving along here is blurred. And that's the idea. When you have your shutter open longer, the movement is what you're capturing. And if we had 1/4 of a second here, same setup, it's just totally blurred because it's going by so fast. So the longer your shutter is open, the more subject blur you will get. Again, here's a car, and this is a 30th, which is pretty slow, so it's not exactly sharp. And this is 1/500th of a second, and this is frozen. So that's a really pretty good sequence of those two. Now it's better on this panning if the subject is really going left to right or right to left. In this second shot, it's more of an angle, and you won't capture the motion in the same way. This technique is best used when your subject is right there in front of you, perpendicular to where you're at. Okay, there's a couple of shots here of just activity. This guy's running 1/30th of a second. Again, it's pretty slow. And 1/100th of a second is enough to completely freeze the subject here. Now let's look at these other settings here too. So the photographer here did adjust the ISO, and this one here, because it's so fast, even when the ISO is up, it's still a little dark. It's acceptable. There's not a problem with that, but there is a difference, okay? So this ISO of 1000 actually kind of creates a better overall light, but when you're dealing with motion, you use the three elements, which is the shutter, the aperture, and ISO. It's the triangle. All right. This was a pan technique, and when you are swinging your camera left to right, even though this four-wheeler may be going at a pretty good speed, it looks like it's just stalled out there. Now, if this is done just right, then the background might actually be blurred in a kind of a left to right fashion, and that can create sort of a sense of speed. In this one, even though it was a panning shot, the shutter, and I don't really quite understand what this shutter setting is, but it was obviously too slow to freeze this motion, but it did create this kind of interesting effect. So what I'm trying to get you to do with shutter is to understand it's a tool that you can use to create certain effects. And blurring is one of the effects, and freezing is the other. So this is also a pan one, and works pretty well because the car is mostly in focus. And here you can see that blur in the background a little better. Then we had a few additional ones that I asked for. This is a really good effort. It doesn't come off quite crisp. One thing that probably would have helped in this setting is to have an additional light source coming in here. It doesn't have to be a photo light or a flash, but it would be nice to have a little bit more light. When you have a little bit more light, then you can kind of do a few more things. So this is shot at 1/400th of a second, which it was fast enough to more or less capture the motion. But if you actually had 500th of a second is where you really start to see that freeze effect. 1,000th of a second is even better. But remember, when you're doing that and you're opening the shutter for such a small amount of time, I mean, think of it, a 500th of a second. That's a very short time. So you have to manipulate, like with your f-stop, and this may be as low as this lens gets. Remember, the lower the f-stop, it really means the bigger the hole or the aperture is. The other element that you can do is to boost your ISO, which is the light sensitivity measure of your camera. It's not the perfect solution because it's also creating more of the noise that can kind of make your photograph not look really sharp. But I applaud this also because of this background, which was really nice and simple, and it lets this subject really stand out. Some of the shots that you guys have been shooting all the time, you're not looking and seeing what the background is. And when you've got just a whole bunch of, I call it clutter, it's just stuff that's in the background that detracts from your image. So see, this is a very nice photo, and you can see that the water down here is pretty well frozen, and this is really nice and sharp, well focused. Now, the only thing I would say would be if you had a background more like this instead of all this clutter back here, it would be a really more interesting photo. But it's a good photo anyway, and definitely shows what we're doing here. Okay, here's another one, and this is a good frozen in action 1/500th of a second. There it is right there. And yet the overall exposure is good. The ISO is not insanely high or anything. In fact, that's pretty low. But this is a good job of freezing the kid in the air. Again, if you had a background that was maybe where you were down lower, maybe on your knees, or even laying down and shooting up, and you had just the sky back here, this would be an awesome shot. When you've got all the housing back here and poles and things like that, it's a little distracting. But I wasn't really asking you to take a perfect photograph. I was asking you to capture the motion. Therefore, this is a good photo. Now, let's go back here just for a second. Shutter speed of 1/500th of a second or higher will freeze the motion. A shutter speed of 1/8 of a second or slower will blur the motion. In other words, you are actually capturing the motion by having it blur. When you get to 1/8 of a second, it is pretty darn hard for most people to hold the camera steady enough to get a sharp image. It's not impossible, and if you lean up against a tree or put your camera on a wall or something like that, you can, shoot slower speeds without getting unnecessary blurring. Tripod is really the way to go. When you want to add to your photography arsenal, a tripod is something that's really, really good. You don't have to move your camera like a video on the tripod, so you can use a pretty simple, inexpensive tripod. You just want to hold the camera steady. All right, now there's a couple of potential issues, and I think I saw a bunch of this. One was excessive light. In order to get your shutter speed slow, oftentimes that is letting in too much light. So you can adjust two things. You can adjust your aperture, sometimes called f-stop, and if you crank it up to a higher f-stop, and that makes a smaller hole, it will reduce the amount of light that can come in, and perhaps you'll get a better photograph doing that. And you also have more focus, because when you use the higher f-stop, you get more in focus. The other issue that I saw quite a bit is unintended blur. It's fine to have, your subject blurred because of the motion, but you don't want everything blurred. And again, it's really a challenge to do this. I'm not saying this is an easy exercise, but it is something you should practice, and you should try to master that. So let's look at some examples that I just went out and found. So here's a 500th of a second, and the kid is frozen. This is very sharp up in here. It's nice. And then at 1/8 of a second, the kid is moving, but everything else is too. So this is what I would call unintended blur. And, it's what happens when you shoot at slow shutter speeds. You have to be cautious of that. All right, this is a blurred motion shot with a stationary background. The background here is not changing. Now, what are these? These are headlights. These are cars, taillights that are going through this intersection here. And so to do this, you put your camera on a tripod and then use an extremely slow shutter speed, like maybe 2 seconds, and see what you get. You cannot possibly hold a camera with a shutter speed of 2 seconds and not get unintended blur. So obviously this one had to be put on a tripod. You have to really experiment with this, and it's a cool technique. You can do it with like sparklers and write stuff with a sparkler and capture it that way. There's when you get your shutter speed slowed down and let the blur be captured. Here's another example of motion capture. Here we have a foreground person. That person is in focus, sharp, and not moving at all. But the train that's back here is moving. So this actually makes a really nice photo. And by the way, here's a nice photo that applies the rule of thirds. If the person were just standing in the middle, it's not quite as interesting. Here's a pan shot, and remember, panning is where you're using the camera to capture the motion of the subject in a way that it freezes the subject, so you're capturing this blur in the background and freezing the subject. I recognize that those of you that are doing this without the benefit of a single lens reflex camera, you don't have as many options for some of these exercises, and shutter is a real challenge. There are, if you have a newer iPhone, for example, there are some things that you can do with that. There's more there than you think. We have plenty of students in this class that are using Canon Rebels and Nikon 3100s, and these are cameras that can do this kind of thing. What you have to do is you have to think of these three elements. We've focused on shutter speed today, but they all work together. Okay, so when you have your aperture, which is the hole, the f-stop hole in your lens that lets the light in, when it's really big like that, then you may need to have a quicker shutter speed. And when you have the little teeny hole like f16, you may need to have the shutter open for longer because you have a smaller hole and you have to let the light in. Now, the variable that you can change here that will impact these two other elements is your ISO. Remember, the ISO is really the sensitivity of your camera to light, and you can adjust it. Typically they go from like 100. Well, my really good Nikon camera goes to, I think, 64,000 ISO. When you start getting up into the range above 1600, 2000, somewhere in there, you start getting an effect that's called pixelation or noise, and it's just an artifact of what happens when you have your ISO real high. Sometimes you have no choice. If you want a photo, you're going to have to shoot with a higher ISO. So that's where we are. If you have any questions, of course, just let me know.